My husband's been messaging his high school girlfriend for years, and when I found out, he claimed they were just friends, but now I've discovered she's coming to our house. I'm 33F, married to Chris, 35M, for almost 10 years. We met in college, fell in love quickly, and built a life together. Recently though, things have felt off. He's been distant, glued to his phone more than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Last month, I finally saw a name pop up on his phone that sent my heart racing, Lila. I'd heard that name before, a high school girlfriend he'd once talked about with a certain nostalgic fondness. I asked him about it, and he brushed it off, saying they were just friends, and that I had nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe him, so I let it go. But as the days passed, I couldn't help but notice more and more. He'd step out of the room to take calls, laugh at messages he'd receive while sitting right next to me, and even started staying late at work. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something was going on. One night, when he was in the shower, I gave in to temptation and looked at his phone. What I found made my stomach turn. Dozens of messages between him and Lila, dating back years. They weren't explicit, but they were undeniably flirty. Inside jokes reminiscing about their teenage years, and more than a few comments that crossed the line of just friends. I felt a wave of nausea as I scrolled through them, reading how she called him by old nicknames and how he told her things he hadn't even shared with me. I wanted to confront him then and there, but I needed time to process it. I waited until the next morning, and when he finally woke up, I asked him straight out about the messages. He looked startled, but quickly masked it with irritation. "You went through my phone," he asked, trying to turn it back on me. I wasn't going to fall for that. "Why have you been talking to her for so long?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're just friends, okay? She's someone from my past, and it's nice to keep in touch." "You're overreacting." But I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just some innocent friendship. He had an attachment to her, a connection that had been growing in the shadows of our marriage, and I needed to know why. For the next few days, I couldn't get Lila out of my mind. Every time Chris's phone buzzed, I wondered if it was her. He tried to reassure me, claiming that their conversations were just harmless nostalgia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Eventually, I decided to reach out to an old mutual friend of theirs, someone who'd known both Chris and Lila back in high school. I asked her if she knew anything about them reconnecting. She hesitated, and then she told me something that made my blood run cold. Lila was planning to visit. I confronted Chris that night, asking him if it was true. His face went pale, and he stammered, "I was going to tell you. She's just coming for a short visit to catch up. There's nothing more to it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you were just planning on having her over without telling me?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. He tried to calm me down, saying I was blowing things out of proportion, but I knew better. He'd been keeping this from me, and now she was coming to our home, the place we built together. As the day of Lila's visit approached, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. Chris assured me that it was just a friendly visit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. The night before she was supposed to arrive, I told him I didn't want her coming to our house. "Why can't you meet her somewhere else?" I asked, desperate to regain some control. He got defensive, saying I was being irrational. "She's coming here, and that's that," he said firmly. It felt like a slap in the face, my own husband putting her needs above mine. When Lila finally arrived, I felt a knot in my stomach. She was everything I'd feared, tall, beautiful, with a confidence that made me feel small. She greeted Chris with a hug that lingered just a little too long, and when she turned to me, she offered a polite but distant smile. I forced myself to be civil, but every word felt like a betrayal. She made herself at home, laughing and reminiscing with Chris like they were the only ones in the room. I sat there feeling invisible, wondering how he could be so blind to the pain he was causing me. That night, after she left, I confronted Chris again. "What was that?" I demanded. "You acted like I wasn't even there." He rolled his eyes, saying I was reading too much into things. "She's an old friend, and it's nice to catch up." "You're the one making this awkward," he said coldly. I felt a surge of anger and sadness. Here I was, his wife, and he was dismissing my feelings for someone he hadn't seen in years. I told him that if he wanted to continue seeing her, he'd have to choose her or me, but he just laughed, brushing off my ultimatum. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I called my sister the next day, breaking down as I told her everything. She was furious, insisting that I deserved better. She offered to let me stay with her for a while, and for the first time I considered it. I packed a bag that night, waiting for Chris to come home so I could tell him I was leaving. When he walked through the door, I stood there with my suitcase, feeling a mixture of fear and resolve. "I can't do this anymore, Chris," I said. "Either you end things with her, or I'm gone." He looked at me stunned. For a moment, I thought he might fight for me, tell me he'd choose me over her. But instead, he just shrugged. "You're overreacting," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "If you want to leave, go ahead." I felt my heart shatter, realizing that he wasn't going to fight for us. He was willing to let me walk away, all for the sake of some girl from his past. I turned and left, feeling numb as I walked out the door. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep living in his shadow. I stayed with my sister, trying to piece my life back together. Days turned into weeks, and though I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Chris had reached out a few times, but only to ask if I was coming back, not to apologize, not to fight for me. It was clear that he didn't understand the damage he'd done. Meanwhile, I'd started therapy, hoping to make sense of everything. My therapist helped me see that I'd been sacrificing my own happiness for years, always putting Chris' needs above my own. It was time for that to change. Then one day, I received a text from Chris. "Leela's staying with me," he wrote. I felt a wave of nausea. Was this his way of telling me it was over? I called him, demanding an explanation. He was nonchalant, saying that she needed a place to stay while she was in town, and that it was no big deal. I couldn't believe his audacity. I realized then that he had never respected me, never valued our marriage. It was all a game to him, and I was just a pawn. I hung up, feeling more determined than ever to move on without him. I began the process of filing for divorce. It was painful, and every step felt like ripping off a band-aid. But with each signature, each form, I felt a little stronger. I started focusing on myself, on rebuilding my life without Chris. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and slowly started to feel like myself again. Meanwhile, I heard rumors that Chris and Leela were seeing each other. It hurt, but it also validated my decision. I knew I deserved better, and I was finally ready to let go of the toxic hold he'd had on me. As the months went by, I found myself reflecting on our marriage, wondering how I'd let things get so bad. I realized that I'd been blind to his selfishness, always making excuses for his behavior. But now, with the distance between us, I could see him for who he really was, a man who valued his own desires above all else. I was done being his second choice, done waiting for him to change. I was finally free, and I was determined to build a life where I was valued, respected, and loved. And for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. One afternoon, I ran into a mutual friend who mentioned that Chris and Leela had split up. Apparently, she'd left town, leaving him alone and heartbroken. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. He'd thrown away our marriage for a fleeting fling, and now he was paying the price. But I didn't reach out, didn't offer him any comfort. I'd given him enough of my time, my energy, my love. He'd made his choice, and now he had to live with it. I walked away from that conversation feeling lighter, knowing that I'd finally closed the door on that chapter of my life. Life moved on, and I started dating again. It was scary at first, opening myself up to someone new, but I knew I was ready. I met someone kind, someone who made me feel seen and appreciated in a way Chris never had. With him, I felt safe, valued, and genuinely happy. He knew about my past, about the betrayal, and he was patient with me, giving me the time I needed to heal. For the first time, I felt like I was building a healthy, fulfilling relationship, one built on trust and respect. I was finally living the life I deserved. Then, out of nowhere, Chris showed up at my door one evening. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have let you go." I felt a surge of anger, but also a strange sense of closure. He was finally admitting what I'd known all along, that he'd chosen wrong, that he'd thrown away something real for a fantasy. I listened to his apology, but I knew I couldn't go back. I'd come too far, grown too much, to fall back into the cycle of his lies and betrayal. I told him as much, explaining that I'd moved on, that I was building a new life without him. He looked devastated, but I didn't feel any sympathy. He'd had his chance, and he'd squandered it. I watched as he walked away, knowing that I'd made the right choice. I was finally free from his toxic influence, free to live my life on my own terms. I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I'd taken control of my own happiness. I didn't need him, didn't need his validation. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace my future. Over time, I stopped thinking about Chris altogether. He became a distant memory, a lesson in what I would never tolerate again. I was focused on my new life, my new relationship, and the future I was building. I'd learned to value myself, to set boundaries, and to demand respect. I was no longer the woman who'd let a man's past haunt her present. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to let anyone hold me back. I was living for myself, embracing each day with gratitude and strength. And for the first time, I felt truly happy. Months after Chris's visit, I got an unexpected message from Leela. She found me on social media of all places and sent a long-winded apology. She claimed she hadn't realized the extent of her impact on my marriage, and that she thought Chris and I had drifted apart before she'd re-entered his life. She went on about how she'd made mistakes and wanted to clear the air. I didn't know whether to feel angry or amused. She acted like she'd been some innocent bystander, when in reality she'd crossed boundaries she had no business crossing. I didn't respond, deciding that she was part of my past too. As I moved forward, I started attending more events, getting involved in activities I'd once enjoyed but had abandoned during my marriage. I felt like I was rediscovering pieces of myself that I'd lost. I took a cooking class, joined a hiking group, and even enrolled in an art workshop. I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them. The more I'd built a life separate from Chris, the more I realized how much I'd compromised myself to keep our marriage intact. I was happier, more fulfilled, and at peace with my decisions. One day, I ran into a friend who knew both Chris and me from our early days together. She mentioned that Chris had been going through a rough time, struggling with his decisions, and that he even tried reaching out to old friends for support. I felt a pang of sympathy, but quickly reminded myself of all the times he'd chosen his past over our future. I couldn't let myself get dragged back into his mess. I'd built something good for myself, and I wasn't about to let his regrets pull me back into the web of toxicity I'd finally escaped. Meanwhile, my relationship with my new partner, Alex, 36M, continued to flourish. We shared common interests, had deep conversations, and I felt a genuine connection with him that I'd never felt with Chris. Alex made me feel valued and respected, and he encouraged me to be my authentic self. He knew about my past, but didn't let it define our relationship. With him, I felt safe, cherished, and appreciated. For the first time, I was experiencing a relationship that felt like an equal partnership. I was building a new life, one where I was free to be fully myself. One weekend, Alex and I went on a trip to the mountains. We spent our days hiking and our nights by the fire, talking about our dreams and the future. I shared pieces of my past with him, explaining how I'd let my marriage with Chris consume me, how I'd lost myself in the process. He listened, holding my hand, and told me he admired my strength, that he was proud of the woman I had become. His words filled me with a sense of healing I hadn't expected. I realized I'd finally found someone who saw me for who I truly was. On our last night of the trip, Alex surprised me with a small gift. It was a bracelet with a simple charm, a tree symbolizing growth and resilience. He told me he'd chosen it because it reminded him of me, of how I'd endured so much and yet continued to grow, to thrive. I was deeply touched, realizing just how far I had come. Chris and Leela felt like distant memories, pieces of a life I'd left behind. I was no longer haunted by a betrayal, no longer defined by the pain they'd caused. I'd moved on, and I was proud of it. Returning home from the trip, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It was from Chris. Inside was a letter, pouring out his regrets and apologies. He admitted that he'd been wrong, that he'd let his insecurities and his past ruin the best thing he'd ever had. He said he missed me, that he wanted to make amends, and even hinted at the possibility of reconciliation. I read it over, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. For a moment, I was tempted to respond, but I knew better. His apology was too little, too late, and I'd already found peace without him. Instead of responding, I tore up the letter and threw it away. I wasn't going to let his words pull me back into a life I'd outgrown. I knew that he hadn't really changed, that he was just desperate now that Leila was gone and he had no one else to turn to. It felt empowering to finally close that chapter of my life, to let go of the pain and move forward. I'd built something beautiful for myself, and I wasn't going to let him take that away from me. I was free, truly free, for the first time in years. I shared the story of the letter with Alex, who listened without judgment. He understood my need for closure, my decision not to let Chris back into my life. He reminded me of the strength I'd found within myself, of the courage it took to walk away from a toxic situation. With him, I felt like I'd finally found a partner who valued me for who I was. Together, we continued building a life filled with love, respect, and joy. I knew that I'd made the right decision, and I was excited for the future we were creating together. Life continued to blossom, and I finally felt at peace with my past. I'd learned valuable lessons about self-respect, boundaries, and the importance of valuing my own happiness. The pain Chris had caused was still there, but it no longer held power over me. I knew I'd been through a challenging journey, but I'd come out of it stronger and more resilient. I'd rediscovered who I was, and I'd found someone who loved me for that. As I looked ahead, I felt a sense of gratitude for the life I was living, a life filled with love, growth, and freedom. A few months later, I bumped into Chris while grocery shopping. He looked different, tired, worn down, almost like a shadow of the man he used to be. He tried to make small talk, but I could tell he was struggling. He asked how I'd been, if I was happy. I told him honestly that I was, that I'd found peace and happiness I never thought possible. He nodded, looking down, and said he was glad. I could tell he regretted his choices, that he was haunted by the mistakes he'd made. But I felt no sympathy, only a quiet sense of closure. Walking away from that encounter, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. I knew I'd finally let go of the last remnants of my past with Chris. He was no longer a source of pain, just a part of a life I'd moved beyond. I was proud of how far I'd come, of the strength I'd found within myself. I was no longer defined by his betrayal, no longer haunted by his presence. I was free, truly free, and ready to embrace the future with open arms. My life was my own again. Back at home, I shared the encounter with Alex, who listened and hugged me tight. He reminded me of all the progress I'd made, of how much I'd grown. We spent the evening celebrating not just my freedom from Chris, but the new life I'd built. I realized then that I'd found something truly beautiful, something I would never have discovered had I stayed in that toxic marriage. I was grateful for the journey, for the lessons learned, and for the person I'd become. I knew that I was finally where I was meant to be, with someone who cherished me. In the months that followed, Alex and I grew even closer. We talked about the future, about building a life together, and for the first time, I felt ready. I'd been through the worst, faced my deepest fears, and come out stronger. I knew that I could trust him, that he was someone who would stand by me through anything. I was no longer afraid of the past, no longer haunted by Chris or Leila. They were part of a life I'd left behind, a life that had taught me the importance of self-respect and the value of true, unconditional love. One evening, as Alex and I watched the sunset, he took my hand and asked if I'd ever consider marrying again. I felt a rush of emotions, but mostly I felt joy. I knew that I could trust him, that he was someone who would never betray me or take me for granted. I smiled, knowing that my answer was yes. I'd been through so much, but I'd come out stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace a new chapter. I was excited for the future, for the life we'd build together, filled with love, respect, and mutual understanding. As we began planning our future, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I'd faced betrayal, heartbreak, and disappointment, but I'd also discovered my own strength, my own worth. I knew that I could handle whatever challenges lay ahead because I'd already overcome so much. I was no longer defined by the pain of my past. I was free to create a new story, one filled with love, happiness, and hope. I was finally at peace, finally living the life I deserved, and I knew that the best was yet to come. A few weeks later, I received one final message from Chris. He apologized once again, telling me he hoped I'd found happiness and peace. I read his words, feeling a sense of closure, but also a sense of detachment. I no longer needed his apologies, his validation, or his regret. I'd moved on, built something beautiful for myself, and I was finally free from the toxic grip he'd once held over me. I deleted the message, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I was ready to leave the past behind, to embrace the future with open arms. With each passing day, I grew more grateful for the life I'd built. I'd discovered my own strength, my own worth, and I knew that I was capable of facing anything that came my way. I was no longer defined by my past, no longer haunted by the mistakes and betrayals of others. I was living for myself, embracing each moment with a sense of joy and purpose. I knew that I was finally where I was meant to be, surrounded by people who valued me for who I truly was. My life was my own, and I was proud of it. Looking back, I realized that the pain, the betrayal, and the heartbreak had all been necessary steps on my journey to self-discovery. I'd learned to set boundaries, to demand respect, and to value myself above all else. I'd faced my darkest moments and come out stronger, more resilient, and more empowered than ever. I was grateful for the lessons I'd learned, for the strength I'd found within myself. I knew that I was ready to embrace the future, to build a life filled with love, joy, and fulfillment. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to let anything hold me back. As I looked ahead to the future with Alex by my side, I felt a deep sense of peace. I'd found happiness, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer haunted by the past, no longer defined by the mistakes of others. I was living life on my own terms, with someone who cherished and respected me. I knew that I was finally free, finally happy, and finally at peace. My journey had been long and painful, but it had led me to a place of healing, a place where I could truly be myself. And for that, I was grateful.